The night I stepped through my front door and felt the world close like a trap, something inside me broke so cleanly I could still find the pieces. I had been away for 10 months. War had a shape you got used to, the blood, the boredom, the small mercies. I learned to measure time by care packages and the handful of photos that felt like islands. I imagined the house the same way I left it, smell of coffee, keys on the hook, a woman who could laugh when I came home unshaved and itching for quiet. Instead I found a squad car, lights slicing the dark, and my wife standing on the porch with a face I did not recognize. Her voice was steady. "Officer, that's him." It wasn't the voice that took me down. It was the look on her face, practiced, patient. She had the look of someone who had already rehearsed the lines that night would require. They handcuffed me on the threshold of my own life. I remember the metal cold on my wrists, the way the neighbor's cat streaked between the cars like it understood betrayal better than people did. The cop read my rights. My wife watched, and I kept waiting for the moment she'd run forward and stop them, for the absurdity of this to break into laughter. That never happened. They took me down to the station and booked me on domestic assault. A neighbor heard shouting. The arresting officer explained, eyes avoiding mine. "She says you threw something and threatened her." My wife had told them a story that fit cleanly into a form. They photographed my bruiseless face, logged my uniform in evidence, and then left me in a cell that smelled of bleach and stale coffee breath. I slept there that night on a narrow metal bench while the shadows of other people's mistakes slithered across the concrete walls. My phone sat in my duffel bag like a small, unreachable planet. The detention's log said, "Domestic incident." My mind said one thing, why? When you come home, you expect the first argument to be about the small things, whose turn it is to take out the trash, what to do with the lawn, whether to put the kid in soccer. The kind of fights that leave the furniture intact. You don't expect somebody to build a case around your life the way a mason lays bricks. The next morning the patrol sergeant came with coffee and clipped on sympathy. They released me on a bond that felt like glass, fragile, easily shattered. You sign your name and agree to appear in court. You walk out and the street looks the same but the air tastes like metal. My wife, Mara, had packed a bag and sat at the kitchen table with our son's cereal untouched. She did not hug me. She did not ask where I had been. She had the distance of someone who had already practiced indifference. "Don't touch him," she told our son when he ran toward me. He was 6. He hesitated on the edge of affection, like a dog uncertain whether to come when its owner smells like strangers. "Tell me now," I said. I had the soldier's habit of wanting direct answers. My hands were still shaking. "Tell me what she said, who?" Mara looked at me and for the first time since I knew her I saw pity in her eyes. "It doesn't matter," she said. "You don't remember. You were drinking when you came back. You don't remember. The neighbor called the cops." Those words landed with a kind of clinical precision. She did not sound angry. She sounded like someone reading the results of a lab test. In her version, I had come back broken. In her version, I was the kind of man who could threaten a woman and hurl things across a living room. I tried to tell her. I had been in a war zone. I had been trained to move quietly, to notice details. I had not been drinking the night before. I remembered every mile home. The words came out like ration paper. "I was handcuffed in my own house," I said. "You were arrested at the door," she corrected me. "You can't remember anything from the night, and that's the problem. You could have." It dawned on me then the shape of what had been set. The accusation didn't need to be loud. It needed to be plausible. Neighbor testimony. A shaken voice on the phone. A man in uniform with a hair-trigger temper was cinematic evidence. I looked at the cereal bowl, at the way his spoon lay abandoned. I tried to hold the boy, to make the ordinary act of picking him up feel like something normal, and he folded stiffly in my arms like he was being careful not to break anything fragile. They filed the complaint fast. I'd been home a week before the first hearing. My command in the army filed paperwork. Being arrested under a domestic complaint triggers paperwork worth a field manual full of legalese. The captain called me in the barracks and asked me if I was all right. His voice was the same calm you'd expect from someone who's had to inform families. Then he said, "You need to take this seriously." I did take it seriously. I kept thinking of those who demonstrated under the lights, lawyers, cops, people who made their living off the machinery of guilt and innocence. I had not known any of them personally. My life had been about missions, not motions in courtrooms. But now my name was on motions, and the judge's calendar would decide whether I would ever get my son back without a shadow between us. Mara filed for temporary custody and a restraining order. She did it with the legal efficiency of someone who had been awake nights building a case. My uniforms were hung neatly in my closet. She had taken pictures of a scar on the wall where a lamp had once hit, and said it was from the night. The lamp had been from before I left. She had repainted 3 months prior. The photograph looked convincing in black and white. "Who did this?" I asked her one night, when we weren't supposed to be honest. She looked at me with that same measured expression and said, "You did." That answer didn't resolve into rage right away. Instead, it spread like cold across my chest. You can plan for the obvious grief, a funeral, a breakup. You cannot plan for someone to rearrange your past in a way that makes you a stranger to yourself. I hired a lawyer with a flat stare and a neat suit who promised to tell the truth in court. He asked for everything: service records, deployment schedules, witness lists. He wanted evidence I was awake the whole time. He wanted messages between me and Mara. I handed him a phone with 312 unread texts and a home full of furniture that suddenly looked like props in someone else's play. "He's not a monster," my friend Luis told the investigator from our old neighborhood when the investigator came knocking. Luis was the kind of friend who had waited up for me when I was younger and needed someone boring to keep me from bad choices. He believed in me. His testimony mattered. It was simple. I had been a good father before I left. I had been a good husband sometimes. He confirmed the things I already knew about my own decency. But the law does not weigh decency the way a friend does. There are people who say, "Truth comes out," like it's a law of nature. Truth is not like gravity. Truth is like currency in a war economy. It can be counterfeited, hidden, moved without your knowledge. You learn to chase it, and each discovery is a small victory that costs more than you expected. My quiet revenge began, not with malice, but with the need to breathe. The charges forced me into a corner where the only options were fight or disappear. Disappear meant losing my son to a narrative stitched together by a woman I thought I knew. Fight meant learning a new vocabulary: discovery, depositions, chain of custody. I sat at a table with my lawyer and a man who called himself an investigator. He had the look of someone who made his living turning over stones. He asked for everything: bank records, receipts, credit card statements, security camera footage. I remembered the rental truck we'd used to move things in before I left. I remembered the stack of mail the landlord had kept. He found my receipts, then emails from a motel in town, not mine, of course, but in the course of subpoenas and records we started to peel back layers. The investigator brought me a printout one night, a list of calls from a number I hadn't known existed, a number that, when we traced it, led to a burner phone registered in a name I'd never heard. The pattern was thin, but it was there: late-night texts from Mara to someone named C. She had deleted messages from her phone. People delete things when they think there will be no consequences. I felt the pieces assemble into a geometry of cheating, not just infidelity in the emotional sense, but a calculated arrangement: late meetings, excuses for errands, sudden interest in changing locks. It took the shape of planning. That's the thing about betrayal: sometimes it's not an accident. Sometimes it is geometric, framed to minimize the collateral damage. When I confronted Mara with a printed text, she tried a different look, not pity now, but irritation. "You think this proves anything?" she snapped. "It proves you were absent." "Absence is not a crime," I said. My voice broke like a twig. "It's the reason," she said, "that you don't remember. You weren't here." The lawyer told me to keep my temper. The investigator told me to keep my phone charged. I kept thinking of the child whose cereal bowl still sat by the chair. He did not understand subpoenas. He only understood when I read to him at night, and smelled his hair and tried to be the man my uniform told me I was. The discovery process revealed more than texts. It produced receipts for hotels, photos of Mara at places at odd hours, and the thing that landed like a falling tree, an email from her account to the burner's number asking to make sure it was arranged for the night I came home. The email was circumspect, almost clinical. The subject line: Arrival Logistics. I read it 3 times and thought my chest would split open. She had not only built a story, she had scheduled it. The courtroom has a color to it, a beige seriousness that flattens everything. Judges speak in tones designed to calm. Prosecutors script their questions like men reciting a prayer. My wife sat with her hands folded, wearing the look of a woman who had rehearsed restraint. The magistrate read the complaint in staccato. The prosecutor outlined the witness statements and the neighbor's call. I sat with my lawyer and watched as the state assembled a version of the evening I had not lived. Then the investigator walked in with a folder of things that smelled like paper and academic revenge. He laid out timestamps from security cameras, receipts, and call logs. The burner phone rang in a quiet line of evidence. He called the neighbor, and the neighbor admitted she had been mistaken about times. She had checked the clock wrong. She had meant to say there was shouting, not necessarily me. It was the sort of small human error that can mean everything. The prosecutor, when he saw the emails, shifted. He had built his case like anyone else builds an argument. He wanted to find a clean narrative. My lawyer leaned over and said, "You did well getting this to us." I wanted to laugh, but laughing would have been a betrayal of the emptiness that had been growing inside me. The court removed the restraining order that day. That should have felt like a win. Instead, it felt like the moment the house lights come up in a theater after a bad play. You see all the seams. Mara's eyes on me that day were a furnace. She was cold when we left the courthouse and didn't speak. The silence between us had become a new language. We walked back to the car like 2 people exiting the scene of a crime. Some crimes are domestic and small, others are performed in broad daylight. That night our son slept on my chest for the first time since I'd been home. His breath smelled like toothpaste and gummy fruit. I thought I could move forward. That was naive. I had not accounted for the damage that public shame does to private things. The months after court were quieter but more brutal. Public vindication does not make private wounds heal. People in town still looked at me like a curiosity, like a man who had been on the evening news. Work was awkward. The other soldiers treated me like someone who had carried something back from the front and didn't know whether to ask about it. Mara moved out with a suitcase and the boy's stuffed animal. She left a note on the table. "We need space." She stated it like a clinical variable, like a measured step on a map. I told her I wanted to try couples therapy. She said she would think about it. She never called. The final part of my quiet campaign was truth, but truth has a social gravity. I printed messages and emails and left them where neighbors, friends, and family would find them, in places that looked accidental, in envelopes thrown into a pile of carnival of mail. It was petty, it was surgical. I'd found out she'd been asking for legal advice about custody before the arrest. She'd been planning for how to explain me away. I wanted the people around us to see the pattern, as if seeing it could pull us back to the place where the boy would not be orphaned by rumor and form. One afternoon I met her on the sidewalk, and she confronted me with the evidence I'd left. She asked me why I had distributed the messages. I said, "Because someone had to tell the truth." She laughed in a way that was not funny. "You think destroying my life for your truth is noble?" she said. "I thought getting the truth out would set things right." I said. "It set people against me," she said. "You wanted to be vindicated, so you made me a villain." I had not considered how my actions looked from the other side. In trying to show I was not a monster, I had given people new reasons to point fingers. The world is not made of clean absolutes. You cannot publish evidence without rearranging someone else's life. My son's schoolteachers asked me what had happened. They were careful and clinical. He took my name when the teacher read the roll call and then clung to my leg on the playground, as if proximity could anchor him to the father he wanted. I remember thinking, not for the first time and not for the last, that the person who had most paid for this entire thing was a 6-year-old who had seen more grown-up arguments than cereal boxes. I used to think revenge was a concept from bad movies. A man storms a house, dust flies, justice is done with a gun. I learned the more painful truth: revenge can be legal and quiet. It can be paperwork and subpoenas and the slow, awful process of convincing strangers one paragraph at a time that your life is not a single headline. The turning point came when Mara's new lawyer subpoenaed me for depositions about my behavior overseas. He asked about yelling, about stress, about incidents I had told only in the quiet minutes with friends. He asked about a time I had come back and smashed a door in a rage during a training exercise years before. I answered truthfully. The truth can cut both ways. His line was obvious. Even if she had plotted, perhaps I had the temperament for what she feared. I left that deposition feeling hollow. I started to see myself as other people saw me, a man with a short fuse and a history that could be misframed. I started to understand that my efforts to write the public record had also given ammunition to those who wanted to paint me imperfectly. The law likes black and white. Life insists on gray. Then came the moment that finally closed the book on us. Our child had a recital, the kind small-town parents line up for, the woodwind ensembles and off-key handling of Beethoven. Mara had said she'd bring him. She did not. She sent him with a neighbor instead and told the neighbor that I should not be allowed near the child without supervision. I went to the recital anyway and sat in the back while the boy marched on stage and played something that sounded like something he had agonized over. He saw me and his face split open into the grin he had when nothing complicated was on offer. He looked proud that I was there. Afterwards, at the church gym where all small recitals end, he ran to me while Mara watched from across the room. He held a crayon drawing out like an offering. "Daddy," he said, "I made this for you." It was a crooked drawing of two stick figures, one bigger than the other, both smiling. The bigger one had a rectangle on the chest with stars, probably my uniform. I held it like a reliquary. Mara's voice behind me was low. "You ruin everything," she said. "For who?" I asked. "For him," she said. "You can't fix this." That phrase, "you can't fix this," is sharp and final. It is the sound of doors closing. I watched her walk away and felt something definitive slide through me. You cannot argue someone back into love. You cannot litigate affection. The divorce papers came like a transfer order, impersonal, inevitable. She wanted full custody and spousal support. The town's gossip produced a chorus. Did you see the way she looked? Did you see the way he defended himself? People took sides because people like side-taking. It is more comfortable than confusion. At trial I sat under a light that felt like an interrogation lamp. Mara took the stand and told a story I barely recognized. She told it well. She told it like someone explaining the shape of a wound. She spoke about fear and about not knowing when an argument would become violent. She framed the arrest as the point of no return. A man once arrested, she said, is always capable of it again. We both testified, and truth did its complicated work. I testified about deployments, and the tedium of reintegration and the confusion I had felt the night I returned. I told them I had not been violent. The jury listened with the same polite attention they give most pain. In the end, the judge split custody. He cited the best interest of the child, the constraints of work and stability, and ordered a schedule that left me with weekends and school day pickups every other Thursday. He called it equitable. I left the courtroom with a reduction of my life that felt like a slow excision. Mara moved in with someone months later, a fact that reached me in a slow, sour string of messages. People tried to congratulate me on being free. Freedom did not feel like a cliff, it felt like an amputated limb. I could move, but not with the same range. The last scene in which we shared a room was the day the realtor came to list the house. We had been served with papers that meant our marriage could be legally dissolved in 90 days. We spent the morning handing boxes to movers like accomplices in an operation that should have felt easier because of paperwork. Our son came home from school and sat on the stairs watching people load up a truck. He asked, "Why are they taking our couch?" "We're moving the couch," Mara answered. Her voice was practiced and flat. "Where is Daddy's picture?" he asked, pointing to a shelf where a photograph used to stand, me in uniform, smiling like a foolish man who believed in return. "I don't know," Mara said. And she looked at me as if asking the question might be proof of some unspoken guilt. When they finally drove away with boxes stacked like small accusations, I stood on the porch with my hands in my pockets. I watched our son's face at the car window. He turned once, a small motion, then faced forward with the posture of someone learning to be brave. I thought about the years before deployment, about the laughter at late-night diners, about arguing about paint colors while the world outside was oblivious. I thought about the way betrayal had not always been intentional, how it can creep in as disconnection. I thought about the way legal systems turn human mess into clauses and orders. I walked out of the house I had come to from war and left it without slamming the door. I did not need to. The click that closes things had already been made. Months later I moved into an apartment with 2 windows that opened to the same street Mara and our son lived on. I could see them at a distance, her hair in sunlight, his small back as he ran to a neighbor's. I went to work. I learned to make coffee that did not taste like the same morning. I went to therapy because the Army recommends it, and because it felt like a proper place to unload a map of the ways my mind looped. Therapy taught me things I had known and refused to feel. The quiet buildup of resentments, the way small silences multiply, the economy of attention. I told my therapist I felt like an actor who had been in the wrong play. She said that sometimes people only learn the rules of a relationship after they have broken them. That was a neutral observation, the way therapists must be. One night, when the city smelled like rain and someone across the street had left a porch light on, my son knocked on my door. Mara had dropped him off and said she had an appointment. He came in wearing his sneakers and a backpack and the kind of shameless joy that 6 years affords. "Hi, Daddy," he said. He walked into my tiny living room with the ease of someone who still knew the geography of me. We went to the park. We ate ice cream. He asked me about the tattoos on my arms and about the places I'd been. He spoke about school as if it was the most important war of his day. He asked where our picture was. I told him I kept it in a box because I thought memories needed to rest. He nodded as if he understood. At the playground an older boy pushed him hard and he fell, scraping his knee. He cried, then held out his hand for me without looking for permission. I picked him up, wiped his knee, and told him it would be all right. He hitched back onto my hip, and I felt for a half-second like a man who had been granted a reprieve. But reprieves do not equal closure. In the years after the divorce I learned to watch the small things dissolve, holidays that were now split into relegated halves, birthdays that required calendars and agreements, the way he sometimes wrote, "Daddy," in crayon, and then underlined it with an apology I could read in the careful strokes. I learned to live with the knowledge that there are stories people tell themselves to survive. For Mara it had been the story that a marriage could not be tolerated with a man who once had an arrest on his record. For me it was the story that truth could restore an order that betrayal had broken. Life proved more cunning than either story. The last page of this thing we called us closed quietly. Not the finale of a movie, not a public spectacle, but a line drawn in a notebook and signed. The divorce became final, and life rearranged. I moved cities eventually, because staying on the same street felt like living in a museum of faults. People I knew from before asked if I had gotten even. I would tell them no, and that would be true in the narrow way: no dramatic revenge, no violence, no theatrics. But the word even is narrow. In the quiet way I had fought, with subpoenas, and thin printed proofs, I had reclaimed the narrative enough to stay in my son's life. That was not victory in the chest-pounding sense. It was maintenance work. The finality that haunted me was different. I had been changed by being returned to a civilian world where the stakes of a misplaced story were family and custody instead of immediate, tangible danger. I had been reshaped. I had been taught the slow cruelty of things that appear small but are structural, the cost to reputation, the way a casual word can become a legal fixture. When our son turned 9, we had a small party. I sat in a corner and watched him open presents. He pulled something out, a frame with a picture of a man in uniform, a man with eyes that looked like mine. He ran across the room and handed it to me with that same uncalculated love young children have. "Keep it," he said, "so you don't forget where you are." I put the frame on my small shelf. I kept it there, not because it fixed anything, but because some things resist annihilation. The legal battles and the courtroom theatrics could not erase the bedtime readings, the scraped knees, the way he slept like an animal at ease. I do not want this to be a morality tale. There is no neat lesson carved in granite. There is only the fact of a life rearranged, people who once promised each other everything now stranded on separate shores, a child learning how to be the bridge. If I have revenge at all, it is the tiny kind, the keeping of truth, the refusal to let a lie become a permanent map. It is the slow maintenance of a relationship with a boy who will one day be old enough to read court records and social media and decide what his father was. Until then, I will be the man who shows up on the days the calendar allows and the man who says the hard words when it matters. On some nights I lie awake and imagine different versions of the same day, the ones where the phone call never came, or where conversation did not harden into accusation. Those are indulgences. The life I have is the one with a mailbox full of forms and a calendar with pick-up times. It is a life that makes room for small mercies. There is a finality to it that I accept. I lost the marriage. I did not lose the boy. Losing part of yourself is a kind of permanent fracture. You learn to carry it without asking for pity. You tell your story in the exact voice of someone who has lived through it, not to convert anyone, but to keep a record of what it felt like to be the man who came home and found the house in a different order. I do not have illusions about closure. I know how many people will watch this and partition sympathy like coins. But money cannot buy back a decade of mornings. The truth I fought for is not a tidy trophy. It is the small, stubborn thing of being present when he needs me, which in the end feels like the only currency anyone ever truly needs. The last line I will offer is not a shout. It is a quiet, unadorned fact. Some doors close forever, some open on different hinges. I learned to live with the doors that remained. I had days that began like any other, alarm blaring at 0600, coffee brewing, the hum of a street waking. But the quiet in the apartment was different. There were no echoes of Mara moving through rooms, no arguments simmering under fluorescent lights, no chairs scraping against tile. The absence was almost audible, and it followed me in the spaces between things. Even the morning news felt like a background whisper rather than a shared ritual. The first few months after the divorce were a blur of forms, therapy sessions, and custody schedules. I learned the delicate arithmetic of living for someone else's timeline, school pickups, dental appointments, soccer practice. My calendar was divided into blocks with labels like dad days and parenting time, as if my access to my own son had become a quantifiable commodity. I learned to track my mood and energy in the same way I tracked appointments, to preserve enough patience for when he showed up. He came on weekends, sometimes shy, sometimes bursting through the door like a tornado of energy. He had grown in the months I had been away. His shoulders were broader, his voice deeper in sudden moments, but his hands were still small enough to fit inside mine. Those days were my lifeline. We ate pancakes that never looked like the pictures, we built forts from sheets and chairs, and we stayed up late reading books he had chosen himself. I became conscious of every word, every look, every moment. One afternoon, we went to the park. He ran ahead, laughing as though the years of tension did not exist. I followed, hands in pockets, watching him navigate the jungle gym like a small conqueror. At one point, a boy much bigger than him shoved him from behind. He fell, scraping his knee and wincing, but did not cry. I knelt beside him, checked the wound, and kissed it lightly. He gripped my hand tight and whispered, I knew you'd come. That phrase, so simple, hit harder than any courtroom victory. Mara could take away weeks, months, even years of shared life. But she could not take that. My presence, my love, my commitment, those were mine to give. That realization shaped the quiet drive behind everything I did: work, therapy, patience. My life was no longer about vindication, it was about stewardship. Even with this focus, the ghost of what Mara had done lingered. Every time I ran into her on the street, every time she picked him up from school, I felt the old surge of rage, the dull ache of betrayal. I did not confront her anymore. Confrontation had its time and place, and I had learned that direct engagement usually left more collateral damage than resolution. Instead, I kept my boundaries firm. Every phone call was documented, every interaction polite but precise. I learned to measure my reactions like a soldier measuring distance in an unfamiliar landscape. Yet, life has a way of forcing confrontation even when you are careful. One evening, I arrived at the school to pick him up, only to find Mara already there, arguing with the principal. She looked sharp, prepared, the same intensity she had brought to the courtroom. The issue was small on the surface, a permission slip she insisted I had not signed, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. A test, a measure of my patience. I walked up, calm but alert, and said, "I'll handle it." Mara turned, eyebrows raised, the half-smile of someone who had rehearsed their lines. "You'll handle it," she repeated, voice low, almost mocking. "Yes," I said. "Because it's my job as a parent, not because it's a game." The principal stepped in. My son looked at me, sensing the tension, unsure where to stand. In that moment, I realized the most difficult battles after betrayal are rarely dramatic. They are the quiet assertions of dignity, the consistent maintenance of trust, and the slow building of reliability that no one can dispute. Weeks turned into months, months into a year. I settled into the rhythm of life that did not include Mara as a partner but did include her as a co-parent. I watched my son grow, noting the subtle shifts in his personality. The way he would sometimes echo phrases I had said, the little jokes he remembered from our reading sessions, the small marks of affection he left for me, a drawing, a note, a hug before bedtime. These things were fragile but irreplaceable. My work life also shifted. The Army Reserves gave me structure, a semblance of familiar rigor. I volunteered for assignments that allowed me to stay close to home. I rebuilt relationships with friends who had waited quietly, unsure how to support me. Social gatherings were difficult at first. Small talk became a minefield of judgment and speculation. But I discovered that patience and consistency were more powerful than protestations. Eventually, people stopped asking about what happened with Mara and started asking about me. About us. About the boy. Therapy remained essential. Each session peeled back layers I hadn't realized I was carrying. The shame of arrest, the humiliation of being misrepresented, the complicated guilt of knowing that someone I loved had consciously hurt me. My therapist asked difficult questions. Could I forgive? Could I let go? Could I separate my son's love for me from the anger I felt toward his mother? The answers were complicated. I could forgive in principle but not forget. I could release my anger in measured doses, but I had to remain vigilant for manipulation. One night, my son and I stayed up late building a model airplane. His hands were sticky from glue, and he laughed at my fumbling attempts to cut pieces properly. In the quiet glow of a desk lamp, he looked up and said, "Daddy, do you hate Mommy?" I froze. The question had been sitting between us, unspoken, waiting for an innocent mouth to articulate it. "No," I said carefully. "I'm disappointed in some things she did, but I don't hate her." He nodded slowly, as if absorbing a lesson too complex for his age. "I just want us to be a family." I smiled through a twinge of pain. "I do too, buddy. I do too." It was a fleeting, fragile thing, but it was real. It reminded me that life after betrayal is not about erasing pain, it's about creating pockets of normalcy in which love can thrive despite the past. There were times I considered new relationships. I went on dates, tried to meet people, but it was complicated. Trust had become a scar I carried openly, and no amount of charm or connection could erase the memories of betrayal. I learned to be honest with potential partners about my son, my past, my boundaries. Many walked away, some stayed cautiously, carefully. In those relationships, I realized something fundamental. The world would never be as simple as I wanted it to be, but I could create spaces of honesty and stability. That was enough. Mara remained a constant presence at the edges of my life. Occasionally, she would test boundaries: a late phone call, a question about school activities, a complaint about parenting choices. I met each intrusion with measured calm. Anger flared internally but was tempered externally. I realized that survival wasn't about winning every argument. It was about being the parent my son needed while maintaining my own integrity. One winter evening, Mara called about an emergency at school. Our son had fallen during recess and scraped his elbow. I picked him up, drove him to urgent care, and tended to him while Mara waited outside. She stayed silent, watching, as if my competence was a revelation. I did not seek approval. I did my job. That night, my son fell asleep with his head on my chest, and I felt a quiet triumph. Some battles are not fought with lawyers or courts, but with presence, attention, and love. As years passed, the intensity of anger and betrayal softened but never disappeared. It became a quiet hum beneath the surface, a reminder of how carefully life can be rearranged by someone you trust. But I learned to navigate it, to carry it without letting it define me, to distinguish between justice and obsession, between protection and vengeance. My son grew into the middle of childhood, and I saw glimpses of resilience and joy in him. He learned to ride a bike, to make friends, to navigate small schoolyard disputes. Every milestone was a victory not just for him, but for me, proof that love could persist despite betrayal, that truth and consistency mattered more than dramatic vindication. I wrote letters I never sent. I documented moments of kindness, acts of courage, small victories in parenting. Sometimes I would read them late at night and cry quietly. Not from sadness, not entirely, but from the weight of having survived a betrayal so calculated, a life so meticulously disrupted, and still found a way to protect what mattered most. I realized that the story Mara and I had begun, the story of love, betrayal, and loss, was no longer mine to rewrite. It existed in fragments, in court records, in whispered gossip, in the memory of the apartment, in the eyes of my son. My role now was caretaker of what remained, steward of what was still possible, and witness to the long, slow, uncompromising task of rebuilding. The final chapters of this life are quieter than the opening. There are no arrests, no courtroom drama, no explosive confrontations. There are school plays, bedtime stories, scraped knees, and honest conversations. There are moments of joy intertwined with the ever-present ache of what was lost. I have learned that betrayal does not end with legal victories, and revenge does not conclude with public vindication. Life moves in subtler increments: the careful cultivation of trust, the unwavering presence for a child, the measured response to provocation. That is the reward, the punishment, and the lesson all at once. I have rebuilt my life not to erase the past but to coexist with it, carrying its weight as a reminder and a shield. And in the quiet evenings, when my son sleeps and the city hums outside, I allow myself one small truth: I survived the betrayal, I preserved what mattered, and I am still whole enough to feel joy, even when it is tempered by memory. The story is not heroic. It is not cinematic. It is mundane, painful, and relentless, but it is mine. And in that, I have found a kind of finality. A life reclaimed, a love maintained, and a child who knows me as I truly am. The years crept by in a rhythm I had learned to accept. I watched my son grow taller than me in spurts that felt almost overnight, saw his voice deepen, saw him navigate school, friendships, and the small cruelties of life with a resilience I both admired and feared. I understood then that betrayal isn't something you just survive. It follows you in echoes, shapes the way you move, the way you interact with the world. Sometimes I would catch Mara watching him from the distance, subtle in her gaze, a careful observation that betrayed a lingering attachment. Other times, she was absent entirely, absorbed in her own life, new partners, or distractions. The tension never went away, it shifted shape. It became a shadow I carried in the form of planning, of parenting, of ensuring my son's stability. I realized that custody agreements, court orders, and legal victories were scaffolding, but emotional security had to be built brick by brick, hour by hour. There were mornings when he would climb into bed with me, curling his small body against mine like he had when he was a toddler. Sometimes he would whisper worries about school or friends, sometimes about Mara. He was perceptive enough to feel when I was holding back anger, when I still carried resentment. And I had to be careful. I had to carry my past as armor, not as a weapon. I learned to filter my words so that my son would never feel the weight of Mara's betrayals or my own anger. One morning he asked, "Daddy, do you think Mom ever regrets anything?" I paused. His small face, earnest and unknowing, demanded honesty but not the full measure of adult complication. "I don't know," I said. "Sometimes people don't see what they've done until much later. What matters is that we move forward. We live well." He nodded and went back to breakfast, seemingly satisfied, though I knew his young mind would file the moment away somewhere between trust and uncertainty. The subtle victories of life came quietly. He learned to ride a bike without training wheels. He made friends and invited them over without asking permission, filling the apartment with the chaos of childhood. I learned to let go of control, to step back and watch him navigate mistakes, to celebrate successes without overshadowing them. These small moments were more meaningful than any courtroom ruling. I started dating cautiously. It was difficult. The scars of Mara's betrayal lingered like unhealed wounds. I was wary of trust, and I could sense the hesitancy of anyone new, even before it was spoken aloud. But eventually, I met someone steady, someone quiet who appreciated the layered complexity of my life rather than trying to erase it. She did not try to replace Mara. She did not attempt to correct my son or me. She simply existed alongside us, creating a space where healing was possible without erasing the past. Mara's presence never fully disappeared. Occasionally, there were disputes, over scheduling, over holidays, over school trips. Every call and text became a negotiation. Sometimes she used guilt as a weapon, a subtle reminder of past proximity and promises. I had to navigate these moments carefully, keeping my own emotions in check for the sake of our son. I realized that surviving betrayal is one thing, coexisting with the person who perpetrated it while protecting a child is another. One winter evening, she called about a school project my son had neglected. I picked him up, drove him home, and helped him complete it while Mara waited outside. She watched silently, like a ghost haunting the periphery of our lives. I did not ask why she was there. I simply did my job, steady hands, calm voice, patience above all. My son's eyes flicked to her briefly, then back to me, as if seeking reassurance that the two of us could coexist without reliving old pain. The psychological aftermath of Mara's betrayal followed me in unexpected ways. I became hyper-aware of manipulation, learned to read subtle shifts in tone and expression, and overcompensated for any hint of unpredictability. It made me cautious, sometimes excessively so, in both relationships and parenting. I noticed how I reacted to stress, to small irritations, even to simple misunderstandings. The war had taught me discipline, the betrayal had taught me vigilance, and together they shaped the man I was becoming. Therapy remained a quiet anchor. Each session reminded me that healing was not linear. I processed anger, disappointment, and the humiliation of being misrepresented to friends, neighbors, and even my own child in subtle ways. My therapist once said, "You are teaching your son resilience by modeling it yourself. But you must also allow yourself moments of vulnerability." I realized she was right. Vulnerability was not weakness, it was authenticity. Holidays were particularly difficult. Birthdays, Christmas, Thanksgiving, each event was a negotiation, a careful choreography of time and attention. Mara would sometimes manipulate schedules, testing my patience. One Thanksgiving, she insisted our son spend the morning with her new partner, delaying our agreed-upon pickup. I waited, silently, until my son finally arrived. He had a small frown on his face, confused by the sudden shift. I held him and whispered, "It's okay. You're safe now." That phrase became my mantra. Life had thrown a storm of betrayal, accusation, and legal battles, but I could offer my son a constant presence, patience, and protection. I realized that the measure of success was not revenge or punishment, it was the stability and love I could provide for him. There were times, however, when anger resurfaced unexpectedly. I would see Mara's car on the street, hear her voice in a voicemail, or read her words in a text. The old rage flared, raw and immediate. But I learned to recognize it, to breathe through it, to channel it into constructive action rather than reaction. I reminded myself constantly, my goal was not to punish her, but to preserve my son's well-being. One summer evening, my son and I went to a park near our old neighborhood. Mara was there with friends, distant but visible. My son ran ahead, laughing, unaware of the tension. I stayed back, watching both of them, feeling the old pain resurface but also noticing how far we had come. My son's laughter was proof that love could persist despite betrayal. It was the small, unyielding victory that mattered more than any courtroom ruling. I continued to build my life with intention. I developed new routines, nurtured friendships, and cultivated patience in ways I had never known before. Every time I saw my son thrive, every small milestone he reached, I felt the quiet affirmation that I had survived, that I had not allowed betrayal to define me completely. In moments of solitude, I reflected on the nature of trust and deception. Mara's calculated actions had taught me to be cautious, but also to value authenticity. I realized that betrayal does not always arrive with dramatic violence. Sometimes it is quiet, insidious, and deeply personal. And surviving it requires more than anger, it requires endurance, vigilance, and an unwavering commitment to what truly matters. The story does not have a cinematic finale. There is no dramatic confrontation, no climactic moment of revenge. Instead, it exists in the quiet victories. My son asleep in my arms, his laughter echoing through a sunlit apartment, his small hand grasping mine with unwavering trust. There is triumph in patience, in steadfastness, in the ability to continue showing up even when the past has been fractured beyond repair. I learned to measure success in increments of care, in moments of presence. Every scraped knee I tended, every homework assignment I guided him through, every bedtime story I read became a building block in a life reclaimed. Mara's betrayal was a fracture that reshaped our world, but it could not erase love. It could not erase the bonds I nurtured with my son. And in that quiet, measured existence, I found a final truth: survival is not about revenge, and victory is not about punishing the guilty. Survival is about persistence, presence, and the slow, deliberate construction of a life that protects the ones you love. Time moved in a strange way as he grew older. Adolescence arrived slowly, then all at once. His voice deepened in uneven cadences, his body stretched awkwardly overnight, and the easy innocence of childhood became layered with self-awareness. He began asking questions that cut sharper than any courtroom testimony ever had. "Dad," he said one afternoon as we were walking home from school, "why do Mom and I have to live like this? Why can't we just be a family?" I stopped on the curb, feeling the weight of years in his small, earnest face. I wanted to give him a simple answer, but there was none. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "people make choices that hurt others. We do the best we can with what we have. You and I, we make our own family every day." He nodded slowly, not fully satisfied, but willing to accept my honesty. That moment reminded me that truth is rarely neat. It comes in fragments, in gestures, in quiet constancy. It was the same lesson Mara had tried, consciously or not, to disrupt with her betrayal. The world does not revolve around dramatic resolutions. It is built from small, repeated acts of presence. High school brought new challenges. My son started spending more time with friends, more hours in activities I couldn't fully supervise, and the negotiations with Mara grew tense again. She questioned school trips, social outings, even friendships. The familiar edge of control she wielded came wrapped in concern, masking old patterns. I stayed calm, relying on documentation, agreements, and the slow, steady force of consistency. He began to sense the tension between us, between his parents, and it sometimes made him anxious. I had to learn the art of shielding him from adult conflicts while remaining honest. "Your mom and I have our differences," I explained one evening while helping him with algebra. "But that doesn't change how much I love you. You're the priority. Always." He looked up at me and asked quietly, "Even if she lies about you again?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Even then. Lies don't change who you are to me." That exchange, simple but loaded, underscored the long-term work betrayal demands. The world Mara had briefly warped, through false accusations, careful planning, and manipulation, was not completely erased, but I was determined to rebuild its foundations. During these years, I developed a cautious approach to relationships. Romantic partners had to understand the nuances of my life, a son whose welfare was paramount, a past that shaped my boundaries, and a vigilance born from betrayal. I learned to be upfront about my history, my fears, and the way I parented. Many relationships did not survive this transparency. Some partners could not navigate the intensity of my attention, my need for honesty, or the presence of legal and emotional baggage. But a few did. One woman, quiet and deliberate, entered our lives gradually. She understood that trust had to be earned in small increments, that love was demonstrated through presence and reliability rather than dramatic gestures. My son warmed to her slowly, cautiously, like a small animal testing the waters. Over time, the stability she offered became a subtle but essential counterweight to the chaos of Mara's lingering presence. Despite the relative stability, Mara remained a constant variable. She had moments of indirect manipulation, sending text messages about trivial matters that escalated into arguments, subtle criticisms of my parenting, or attempts to sway mutual acquaintances with selective stories. I learned to respond with measured calm, never overreacting, and always keeping the child's interests central. One particularly sharp confrontation occurred over a summer camp application. Mara insisted he should attend a camp she had chosen, claiming it would be good for him. I had already enrolled him in a program that better suited his interests and schedule. She called, her tone clipped, attempting to coerce compliance. I listened, acknowledged her input, then stated clearly, "We will proceed with the camp we agreed on. This is what's best for him." The line went quiet. I imagined the frustration, the silent acknowledgement that I had boundaries she could not cross. I realized that a quiet, unyielding resolve, presence, constancy, and calm, was my ultimate method of reclaiming life from the chaos she had imposed. Teenage years brought rebellion, as expected. My son tested limits, sometimes defying rules, sometimes withholding information. I learned patience in ways Mara never had the patience to teach. Each minor act of rebellion became an opportunity to teach responsibility, to model calm accountability rather than punishment or retaliation. "You can't just disappear for hours," I told him once after he snuck out to a friend's house. "You have to tell me where you are. Trust works both ways. I need to know you're safe." He pouted, then sighed, then eventually apologized. He was growing into an independent person, and I realized that part of my role as a father was preparing him for a world where people, even loved ones, can betray, mislead, or disappoint. I could not shield him from everything, but I could provide stability and guidance so that the impact of betrayal would be mitigated. Throughout these years, Mara's influence remained a shadow. There were times when she attempted to paint me as overly controlling, overly strict, or emotionally unavailable. Occasionally, I would receive indirect complaints from school administrators, friends, or family. I learned to document every interaction, maintain calm, and respond only with facts. Litigation had taught me discipline, betrayal had taught me vigilance. At the same time, I watched my son mature into someone resilient, compassionate, and perceptive. He learned from my example that anger could be managed, that disappointment did not have to breed hatred, and that truth and consistency were more powerful than vengeance. Every scraped knee I tended, every homework assignment I guided him through, every late-night conversation was a brick in the reconstruction of his understanding of trust. Even as he grew more independent, Mara continued to test boundaries subtly. She would question my rules, compare parenting styles, and occasionally attempt to manipulate schedules. I met each attempt with patience, calm, and clear boundaries. I realized that this long-term struggle was not about revenge or winning. It was about protecting a child from the lingering consequences of calculated betrayal. One afternoon, Mara called, questioning a school permission slip. I calmly explained the situation, restated the agreed-upon plan, and ended the call. My son watched quietly from the couch. Later, he said, "Dad, you didn't yell." "No," I said. "I didn't. Some things are worth staying calm for." He nodded, understanding far more than I expected. That moment crystallized everything I had learned. True power lies in restraint, in patience, in quiet constancy. The years passed, steady and relentless. My son's milestones became my markers of success. First bike rides, first sleepovers, first high school dances. Mara remained a peripheral force, her actions occasionally rippling through our lives, but increasingly irrelevant. My focus was singular: presence, guidance, and love. I maintained therapy, relationships, and a deliberate approach to life. I learned that survival is not about vengeance, it is about endurance, about the slow, deliberate reconstruction of trust, stability, and love. Mara's betrayal had been devastating, but it did not define my life. I could measure my success not in legal victories, but in the well-being and resilience of my son. When he turned 16, he came to me with a question that brought years of reflection into sharp focus. "Dad," he said, "why did Mom do what she did?" I paused, considering. "People make choices for many reasons," I said carefully. "Sometimes fear, sometimes selfishness, sometimes a lack of understanding of how their actions hurt others. But what matters is not why she did it, it's how we respond. We choose to act with love, integrity, and care, and we keep moving forward." He nodded thoughtfully. "So it's not about getting back at her?" "No," I said. "It's about making sure we live well despite it." That conversation, simple on the surface, represented the culmination of years of struggle, vigilance, and quiet endurance. Mara's betrayal had shaped our lives, but it had not broken us. The life I had built, the bond one had nurtured with my son, and the quiet victories of patience and constancy were proof of resilience. As he approached adulthood, the lessons became more profound. He understood that betrayal could be navigated, that honesty and integrity mattered more than appearances, and that love could persist even when trust had been fractured. Mara remained part of our lives, occasionally present, occasionally testing boundaries, but in Korea. I learned that the ultimate victory after betrayal is not dramatic revenge, courtroom spectacle, or public vindication. It is quiet, deliberate, and steady. It is showing up every day, maintaining consistency, and protecting those who matter most. It is the accumulation of small, unglamorous acts that together form a resilient, enduring life. I have watched my son graduate, pursue his own interests, and navigate friendships and relationships with a resilience I had hoped to instill. Mara remains a distant presence, a reminder of past fractures, but no longer a source of control or fear. My life is quieter, steadier, and deeply focused on presence, love, and the cultivation of trust. I understand now that betrayal leaves scars, but those scars can coexist with life. They can guide, protect, and inform decisions without dictating them. The story of Mara and me is not heroic or cinematic. It is grounded, painful, and relentless, but it is ours, and we survived. I have built a life that honors the lessons of the past: vigilance, patience, love, and presence. I have reclaimed my narrative not through revenge, but through endurance, and in doing so, I have preserved the one thing that truly matters: my son, our bond, and the small, quiet victories that make life worth living. By the time my son was 18, the contours of our lives had shifted dramatically from the chaos of Mara's betrayal. The apartment was quieter, yes, but full of routines, memories, and small markers of growth. Every shelf, every photo, every book told a story of endurance. I realized the life we had carved out was not glamorous or neat. It was raw, jagged at the edges, and built from the fragments of what had been broken. I had learned that life after betrayal is not about dramatic vindication. It's about presence. It's about showing up, again and again, even when it hurts. Even when you feel like the world has turned against you. I learned that revenge might provide a fleeting satisfaction, but only consistency, patience, and love leave a lasting impact. I had seen that in the way my son trusted me, in the way he sought guidance, in the small moments when he chose honesty over deceit, courage over fear. There were still shadows, of course. Mara's absence and presence coexisted in strange ways. She appeared occasionally at graduations, school events, or family milestones. Her presence no longer carried power over me. It was simply a reminder of what had been survived. I learned not to react. I learned to hold boundaries firmly without aggression, to respond with clarity, not vengeance. Every interaction was a test of patience, yes, but also a measure of how far I had come. I remember one evening when he came home from college for a holiday break. He had grown taller than I was in the chest, his voice deepened, his face sharper, his eyes more certain. But when he saw me, he ran across the room, threw himself into my arms, and whispered, "I'm glad you're my dad." I held him tight, feeling the weight of every scraped knee, every late-night homework session, every quiet battle I had endured to protect him. Those words were worth all the years of anger, doubt, and betrayal. They were proof that love, when consistent and unwavering, could survive even the deepest fracture. In the end, the story of Mara, of the arrest, of false accusations and betrayal, became a backdrop, a harsh landscape against which I had cultivated a life that mattered. I had discovered that survival is not about winning against someone else. It is about winning over yourself, your fear, your anger, your desire for revenge. It is about transforming trauma into vigilance, resentment into consistency, and betrayal into the foundation for something stronger. I have watched my son navigate life with honesty and integrity. I have watched him form relationships, make decisions, and develop empathy. And in those moments, I understood the final truth: Mara's betrayal could never undo what we had built, could never diminish the bond we had nurtured, and could never erase the lessons learned in the quiet, grueling aftermath of deception. The life I now lead is measured not in dramatic victories or courtroom applause but in presence, endurance, and love. The scars of betrayal remain, but they are not weaknesses, they are markers of resilience. They remind me of the careful attention, patience, and vigilance required to protect those who matter most. They remind me of the power in showing up, in caring consistently, and in modeling integrity even when the world has been dishonest. And so, this is the final truth I carry: the story is not about revenge. It is about reconstruction. About showing up every day, steady, patient, and present. About building a life that survives the storms of deceit, the fractures of betrayal, and the manipulations of those who choose selfishness over love. About cultivating the resilience to endure, to protect, and to love relentless. Mara's choices shaped us, yes. They broke a marriage. They tested trust. They threatened to fracture my life. But they did not succeed in breaking us. My son and I persisted. We endured. We built a life that mattered. And in the quiet moments, when the city hums outside and the apartment is filled with memories, I allow myself a measure of peace. Not the naive peace of forgetting or forgiving blindly, but the hard-won peace of survival, presence, and love undiminished. We cannot choose the betrayals life presents, but we can choose how to respond. And that choice, day after day, moment by moment, is what truly defines victory.